This series has only been going on for a few years, but we already have our great traditions, and I want to tell you about our traditions in case you may not be familiar with them. This interlude comes from the way that Georgia and Michael were with their lives and their musical practice and their personal practice. They used words and music to just talk people into the music. And Michael was legendary for doing this. Michael could write you into a piece of music the way a red carpet drags you into a mansion. I mean, you just walk the carpet, you come in. And he did this thousands of times. He has thousands of notes in program books all over the country and books and articles. And he was a master of using words to help people find a way into music. And as is the case with much of musicology, often there was a lot of forensic work. There was work in terms of trying to figure out what did Beethoven have for lunch that day that caused him to write something. You know, you had to do a lot of sleuthing. And the beauty of this situation is we have everybody here. We can ask the composer, what were you thinking? We can ask the poet, is this a real place? I'm going to ask the poet, is this a real place? We can't do that with Mozart or Haydn or Beethoven. So this is a really fun aspect of this part of things. If this goes well, they will be grabbing the microphone out of my hands, and Lydia will be going around the audience with a microphone, and you will be grabbing that out of her hands. I'll throw a little bit of bait out just to get us started, but we really invite you to join us in asking these questions that you have about the piece or about the process. Georgia, too, and the longer I knew her, I played with Georgia for 25 years, and toward the end of that 25 years, we talked more and more and more to the audience because it just seemed urgent to help people into the music, especially because Georgia had this habit of picking pieces that were unbelievably difficult. And so she was just attracted to these pieces, and she would talk to people in a way as to say, don't be afraid, come with me, come into the piece. Sometimes those of us who played with her felt that way too. She would say, don't be afraid, come with me, I'll play you into the piece. So it's in that spirit that we do this, to welcome you to join us, to not have any kind of separation here between the audience and the people who created and performed this work. I'm going to start with a poem because that's where we start. And I have two questions for you, and maybe one is a small one and one is a really big one. The small one is that I have a feeling that Stone Pond is a real place, and I'm curious to know about it. The bigger one, I've done some sleuthing. I'm not as good at sleuthing as the average 14-year-old on the internet. I have limited skills. But your references to music, your comments about music, I suppose on some level all poets are musicians and all poetry is music, but I have a feeling there's something more than meets the eye here, that you have either a secret life or not so secret life as a musician and a musical practice, and I'm curious about both of those things.
Yes, Stone Pond is an actual place. It is a pond, and it lies just off of Route 2. If you were traveling from Maine, the coast of Maine, over to where I have lived most of my adult life in Cabot, Vermont. So that is an actual place. I guess I can tie these two things together to say that it seems to me that poetry is like all of the other arts in that its main fidelity is to the interior life. And so what you're looking for is something that would express and possibly even make available to others what the interior life is. It's like the bird on the branch, singing the song. It sort of says, I'm here, this is where I am, this is what I see, this is my tree. So Stone Pond, the poem developed out of that, to try to get something that would serve. But yes, I grew up playing the piano and was very, very serious about it. because my older sister played, and I wanted to not only do everything she did, I really wanted to be her. So she got to be older, and she started out early older, but she developed a fondness for long fingernails and fingernail polish before I did. So I stuck with it, and she didn't. So I played a lot growing up, and it was a great refuge for me. It was a place where I felt that I had permission to examine the interior life, and that's where I preferred to live, was on the inside rather than the outside. There are lots and lots and lots of references to music in my poems. I'll talk about that and give you two examples from this poem, just to show you how that might work if your first art is music, rather than, let's say, your first art is painting. Then I think it'd be very, very different what you would turn to. But before you've learned enough language and how to manipulate the language, it's really, really useful to start with some other art and to live within that other art for a while. So on this particular poem, the two places I would point to, the first is very, very small, which is to say to you, that was not Beethoven that I remembered, and it was not Beethoven on the radio. I needed Beethoven's braided musical line. It was actually Schumann. Schumann doesn't work as well. See, that cluster of sounds in there. I wanted Beethoven's braided musical line. I wanted that to get very, very thick right there, just like the circle of mist and black fur, circle, fur, all of that clustering of sounds. That's a small scale music had worked right there, or trying to work. The other is a little bit larger place, and that is at the end of the poem, where there's a fairly major reversal. We have that in poetry with the end of sonnets, the Shakespearean sonnet, for instance, will all of a sudden undermine everything that has come before. All of the arguments that have come before get reversed, get turned on their head. And you probably know that from music, from what happens, let's say at the end of a chorale, when it's been in a minor key and then it shifts into a major key. That's the complete reversal of everything that had happened before. So those are the two places that are small and large that I can see at work in this particular one. It was really interesting to me to hear saxophone. I've had my poems set to music before, but never with a saxophone. And I wanted to ask the composer whether it was the radio that made him think saxophone. I don't know, but let's turn it to him.
Should I address this right now? Okay. Well, I did choose saxophone because there was the radio in it, and because of the driving, you mentioned driving over the limit, and there was a sense of speed and a need for energy, and I thought saxophone would be nice for this. But I hope it was an okay choice. I mean, I don't know, Ellen. That's it.
I have another question for you. But meanwhile, when this poem comes up at a cocktail party, and you casually say, when she wrote that, she wasn't thinking about Beethoven. It was actually Schumann. And they say, how did you know that? You say, well, I attend the Fliesana Steinberg premieres, and she spoke about it. I have a question for Royden, which I suspect many of you have if you've read the notes. What on earth is a musical cryptogram generator, and how did you meet it? Does it have a personality? How do you interact with it? And how was your process? What was behind the choice to use a cryptogram generator? Is that a choice that you have made in other pieces? And tell us about the process of writing this piece.
Sure. So a cryptogram generator is a piece of software on the internet where you can type a word in and it spits out different pitches. So some cryptograms will generate stuff in all 12 pitches of the scale, and some cryptogram generators will generate it all only in the white keys or the diatonic keys. So I chose one and it spit out the letters E, G, A, G, E, and then B, A, B, no, G, A, B, D. And I really liked that because it felt like when I played them, it kind of felt needed for the dissonance and tension in the poem that I found. And so to answer your question, I don't do this for every piece. This is actually the only piece I've done it on. And I don't think I'll do it in any other piece. But for me, this kind of process was just a way of exploring different possibilities as a creator. How can I approach and enter the sound world that Ellen has generated? And through her title, through the words, and through even the visual layout of her poem, I try to come up with different ideas that might work musically in this piece. So yeah, it was kind of fun. I hope that was okay too, Ellen.
If this idea of using random patterns to generate art feels like a modern thing, it's not at all. When we look up in the sky, there isn't actually a hunter there named Orion. There's a random set of dots that we create art around. We've created history and all kinds of art around our connection of seemingly random patterns that the artist makes not random or the poet makes not random. So this is something ancient that we've done. I'm curious for any of, both for Stephen, I know you've been with human and alien actors on stage and with music as well. I'm curious about your process with this piece. I'm curious to hear from musicians about process issues, how you engage. If there's a different way of engaging music with text from music and singer, which of course is somebody with a text, but this is a different kind of thing. Anybody have something you want to throw into the...
I got the best seat in the house because I get to be amongst these beautiful musicians here. But I did some sleuthing and I found a lecture where you were reading this poem, and so I was really happy to hear you read this poem so that I could, first of all, get an idea of what the through line of the poem was, and then also what your punctuation was telling you, especially in terms of it being interspersed at different places in the music. So that was very helpful to have your reference in terms of what the overall arc of the line was. That helped a lot.
Musicians, any
Well, for me, one of the most interesting things about this format, where we actually have a narrator reading rather than a singer singing a song that may be a poem, it's just so clear what the poetry is when it's spoken like that, rather than, when even the greatest songs, it's really hard to understand the words. I mean, there's incredible, even if you know them, it just doesn't have the same impact for me. And so this is really special. And putting this piece together, Royden wrote a tricky piece for us, and we actually love it. We've played it now probably 75 times or something in our rehearsals, and you get to hear it one more time, so you'll hear a lot more the second time, I think. But it's fairly complex. If you look at my part, the first time we all come in together, we have a triplet, and then a quintuplet, then a triplet, and then a duplet, then a triplet in a different tempo, and then a quintuplet in a different tempo, and then a six, and then a five, and then fours, and then twos, and then one. So but it was, I think it's really gelled, and congratulations, Royden, because I think you did a really great job.
I noticed that. I rather admire the place in the poem where it says driving over the limit. You almost make the bus go off the edge of the road by the way that you write. It's really brilliant writing. Questions from audience?
Well, Ellen kind of asked my first question, but I'll bring it up again just in case you want to expand more about the unusual instrumentation. And with the strings, obviously the saxophone is a bit of a surprise. 2 cellos rather than cello and a viola and a violin. So if you have any more to say about that, that's fine. And then the other thing quick was during the bit where the radio was changing channels, did I hear a touch of Piazzolla tango in there?
For sure, yes. There was some tango, there was Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the summer part. And then for the Beethoven reference, which apparently should be Schumann, and I should go and change my score now. But now that I know, but when I saw the poem, I really just went and thought about which Beethoven was it, and I went on a deep dive of all the Beethoven pieces, and I actually landed on Beethoven's Opus 121 Quartet. And I just grabbed that and put it in. But the fun part for me was actually, I took that excerpt and I ran with it and started to write my own things on top of that. And for me, that I think was very unusual as a composer. Usually I don't include Beethoven, but in this case, I include Beethoven. And so yeah, there were these excerpts. And to talk about the instrumentation, when I received the call for the project, I was told that there would be 2 cellos and 1 violin already in the mix, and I had the option to choose 1 extra instrument that would complement it based on the poem by Ellen. And I looked at the poem and I thought, there was the radio, there was the car, there's something noir about it. For some reason, the words spoke noir to me, and I thought of City Noir by John Adams, and that to me spoke to saxophone. And I had written some saxophone music before, and I just loved the power of the tone and the way it can blend with strings and any ensemble really. So I decided that this would be a good time to throw the saxophone in too. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience? Not all at once, please. Lydia, you want to?
Thank you. Tell us more about the despair. The despair that you talk about in the end. Seems like something I can set aside. I circle Stone Pond, and despair seems like something I can set aside. Was there something inherently playing at the time in your mind that you were distracted by the beauty of nature that took the despair away?
Well, it's not the despair, it just is despair. Despair as opposed to joy.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's an interplay, I hope, in the poem between those two things. I mean, driving home, hearing music, getting into the music, all of that is joyous. So, I mean, I don't think I need to define despair to you.
Oh, no, I know all about it.
So it was not a specific grieving or a specific mourning. It was that alternation between joy and despair. Sometimes we succumb to it, sometimes we don't. So that's the interior life that the poem is trying to examine. And a poem is just, I mean, that's what art can do. It allows you to sit still long enough not to have to just cope with whatever the thing is, but sit still long enough and really see if you can discover anything. Investigate and see if you can discover something.
And often the answers do come to you. Often the answers do come to you.
If there are any answers, I'm not sure there are any answers. I mean, I think that kind of tension, I think I've written about that over and over and over. You know, I think that's a recurring subject. I mean, it's a recurring subject for other poets. I can't claim it that, oh yes, I write about joy and despair and nobody else does. No, we all do. I think we all do, just like we all live with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd just also like to speak to that idea of joy and despair just briefly, because I think it's such a beautiful juxtaposition and contrast. And I think, you know, on the other side of despair, of deep despair, is joy. It's kind of this, you know, both sides of the same coin to me. And I think that informed how the music works too, because there isn't really a sense of bursting joy perhaps, but it's a bit of a mingling of both. And that's, I think, the beautiful ambiguity of life, where you get a bit of both, and you live with both at all times. So thank you for writing that line.
With this particular piece, the words came first, and the music was composed afterwards. Could be in some sense, an illumination of the words. Question is, do you have any tension between how literal the music is, a representation of the word, versus how abstract and music standing on its own?
So yes, the words came first. And actually, funny thing is, I just met Ellen in the lobby when we took a picture together. And so during the whole process, I only had Ellen's words. And the reason why I wanted to keep it that way was because I needed to form my own interpretation and way of entering the words. I needed to hear it and ask the questions and have those questions linger. So I hope it's, again, okay, this piece. But it was really a deep reflection on those words and what it meant to me. And this music was a response to it that sort of cloaked and gave perhaps a bit of context or perhaps a bit of visual imagery to the words. At least that's my hope. I hope that answered the question a bit.
I have a question for the composer. Often if we have a vocal line instead of a spoken line, there will be a printed rhythm that the singers would follow, and therefore you could write music that might line up with specific words in a sentence. And I'm wondering with this one, it sounded to me when I heard it that the beginnings of lines and sections were sort of timed with the music, maybe just before a certain section or character or right after. But I'm wondering if you were also trying to time other important words within a line, or if the reader is trying to speak it at a certain pace to sort of line up with anything in the music.
That's also a great question. And in my score, I had arrows that indicate when Stephen would come in with specific fragments of the poem. And my intention was that the words would come first, and then the music would somehow respond to it and change along with the words. So there were certain time sections in the score, but also I wanted to give it an organic feeling so that it doesn't feel like words and then music, words and then music. So then there were times where it seemed to kind of be all together without any particular meter. And we also moved words based on how the musicians responded in rehearsal and what felt best for the balance of the piece too.
I'm curious if both of you could talk about how you approached the punctuation in the poem. I noticed reading it that there's the inclusion of 3 sets of colons. And that's a bit of an unusual kind of punctuation in poetry. Ellen, I know from your work that punctuation is a particular fascination of yours. And I'm also wondering how the punctuation played into the phrasing of the music.
Me first? Okay. Well, it's a linking piece of punctuation. So to get from the first stanza into the second stanza, it makes a logical connection. And the same thing then after the second one, playing well, colon, passing the hillsides. So it's emphatic. It's more emphatic than a period would be, or I guess one could use an ellipses. I'm not sure what else you could use. And then before that turn, that comes toward the end with the joy and the despair that we talked about. So that was sort of in my mind. What was in your mind?
Well, I had your punctuation in mind for sure. And I have to admit that I'm not a writer, and I'm not someone who's, again, very good with words and with punctuation in general. But for me, the punctuation did indicate certain stresses of pauses. The length of pause for a semicolon would be longer than a period and longer than a comma and so forth. So it gave me an idea of musical time in a way of how much music do I write after this, or how much space do I give certain words in the music itself. So it was very important for me to know where the punctuation is. And yeah, great question. Thanks.
Good, and we have time for about one more question over here.
Well, I have 2 questions. The first is, what did you have for breakfast when you wrote this poem? But the real question is, you remind me of Eudora Welty. And I was wondering if, when you write, do you think of other writers and their words and their stories, their lives, their spirit? If you could talk to those, well, the second point mostly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not specifically. I think that everything you read, everything you hear, everything you listen to, it all goes to the same brain. It goes to the same place. So Eudora Welty, she grew up in the South as I did, and she grew up hearing the rhythms of the King James Bible. So we have that in common. I have that in common with Eudora Welty. So it's probably more my accent, I think, that it makes you think of Eudora. Although, I'm always happy to be, to have her called up, that you are reminded of her. That's great.
I know there are other questions, and maybe we'll have a chance to interact around those afterwards as we gather, but I know that you want a second lick of the ice cream cone before it goes away. So we'll set up for another performance of this, and thank you so much for the discussion and for the piece and for the poem.